Well, first of all, we had to demonstrate the problem. So we demonstrated through a series of novel tests that the skin test leaves behind a significant number of infected and infectious animals. These are animals that are not only infected, but they are shedding the organism, Mycobacterium bovis, into the environment, which is then a risk to the cattle around them. We demonstrated that with a series of novel tests, including actiphage, IDEX ELISA, and qPCR to detect the organism in feces. That told us that actually the skin test was not good enough to detect all these infected and infectious animals. So we implemented a regular routine testing program using these what we call enhanced tests to identify high-risk cattle, and we either removed them or managed them to stop the spread of the disease into the uninfected animals that were within the herd. We did this over a period of 3 years, and now the herd is testing clear. It is officially TB-free for the first time in about 10 years.
And this was an experiment you did. How was that funded, Dr. Sibley?
We funded it through our own pockets. I was on a mission. I wanted to prove, like a lot of egotistical, slightly maniacal veterinary surgeons, I wanted to prove that I was right, which I think we did. It's only one herd. It's probably not scientifically robust, but what we managed to do was engage the farmer. He was keen to comply with the requirements that we put upon him. The end justifies the means. The herd is now testing clear, which is what our objective was. And I think this is a program that could be rolled out to a large number of herds that are persistently infected and probably provide the real reservoir of infection. Most of these herds in this circumstance are large dairy herds producing a lot of slurry, contaminating the environment. Not that they wish to or that they do it deliberately. They're doing it unwittingly and unknowingly because they don't realize that they have animals in their herd that are shedding the organism in large numbers.
How big was the herd that you started with, and how many of that herd were infected with bovine TB when you started?
The herd is 350 milking cows with about another 600 or 700 young stock and followers and a beef unit. So there's about 1,100 animals there in total. We were getting at every 60-day skin test anything between 2 and 20 reactors. They lost about 120 cows in the past 5 years through being reactors. But the main significant loss was the fact that the guy couldn't trade. He was having to keep all his beef offspring because he couldn't sell them and having to breed large numbers of heifers to replace those animals that were taken as reactors.
So what was the main difference between what you were doing and what the government was doing? Because here it is reactor, the place is shut down and the animal is removed from the herd and is removed from the entire system. So what are you doing that's different to what is being done?
We were running in total parallel to the statutory control, so that system was continuing in this particular herd, but we were adding another level to it by looking for infected and infectious animals that the skin test had missed. So the skin test probably only finds about 50% of those animals that are actually infected. And out of those, the 50% that it was missing, we found about 15% of the retained animals were actually shedding the disease. They were infectious.
So when you say shedding the disease, you mean like shedding it through their skin, shedding it through the fur? How were they shedding it?
Well, we looked for several places, but they were shedding it through their feces, in their dung.
Right.
And what you've got to remember that an adult Holstein Friesian cow produces between 45 and 50 kilograms of dung a day. And we were finding about 1,000 organisms per gram in that dung. So they were shedding a large number of organisms, despite the fact that many of these cows had had 20 to 30 individual skin tests in their lifetime and not shown up as reactors. So the skin test is missing, and missing infectious animals. And many of your farmers will have experience of this, where animals that have had repeated skin tests go into a slaughterhouse as a barrener, and then they come back as having lesions and are condemned for tuberculosis, despite the fact that they have never been found through the skin test. So this is not an uncommon or an unknown problem. It's just that we were surprised how big a problem it was. In our first round of testing, we found 15 animals that were shedding the disease and had been retained in the herd despite the fact that there had been a skin test only 2 weeks previously.
So the crucial factor, what I'm getting from you in this, is the faeces and what they're excreting, and that is being missed. And maybe we should be testing what they're excreting as well as their skin to find out exactly how many are infected with bovine TB.
Yes, there's various ways of going about it, where there is a whole array of tests now available to detect these animals, but it needn't be quite as complicated and expensive as we did at the Gatcombe project, because really we were following our nose here. You know, we had a hunch, we demonstrated the hunch was right, and then had to implement a plan. Well, I think we learned a lot from that, and we can target our testing program onto particular individuals that are of high risk. But that really is dependent upon the circumstances of the farm, their aspirations as to how quickly they want to get out of this, and what resources there are available.
So when you located some of the animals that had bovine TB, what did you do with those ones that were missed by ordinary testing?
Those that were shedding, we removed. We culled them at a convenient time which suited the farmer rather than at a time that suited APHA.
I'm sure that the farmer wasn't too happy with it. Not only did he have a cull, and whenever the first round of testing came, then you came along and tested it, and then more cows were culled. I'm sure that didn't go down too well.
Yeah, that didn't go down too well, but of course, our test demonstrated to him that these cows were actually dangerous to the rest of his herd. And we could have given him the option of isolating them so that they could, although they were shedding, they could not potentially infect other animals. But in fact, we chose the culling option. Those animals that were infected but not shedding, we retained in the herd and continued to test them to detect when they started shedding. And if and when they started shedding, we removed them, or we could have isolated them. So it's a much more logical and a manageable program than just turning up and finding reactors and killing them. And I think most farmers would accept that, the test and cull program, if they saw that it dealt with the problem. But they see it just going on and on and on.
We've dealt with the issue of what you think the problem may be with reinfecting herds and herds becoming infected. But why do they become infected in the first place? What is your view on badgers and the spread of bovine TB in the countryside by that particular wildlife?
Yeah, I think they have a part, but I think you will be naive to think that wiping out the badger population will solve the problem. It certainly hasn't in Devon. And we tested the badgers at this particular farm because we were concerned that they were involved. And we took 273 fecal samples from badgers, and we found a third of them contained the organism. So there's a heavy infection within the badgers. But interestingly, here on this particular unit, all the TB has been contained in the adult dairy herd, which never go outside. Interestingly, the beef herd, which actually is the opposite, it never comes inside and was grazing those fields where we found the infected badger latrines, has never had a reactor or any form of tuberculosis in it. So I think the badgers play a role in that they can disseminate the infection from these large dairies through ingesting slurry, eating bugs and things that have been feeding on infected slurry, and move it to non-infected herds. But really, they're probably just the messenger. They're not the real reservoir of infection. In my view, the reservoir of infection is held within these large dairies, and the badger is really just a transmission route between them and the non-infected herds. So killing the messenger is not going to solve the problem. But
there has to be something that begins the bovine TB in the first place. It just doesn't manufacture out of thin air. No, there's a reservoir of infection out there. And some people believe that reservoir of infections in the wildlife. Some people believe it's in the cows. I suspect there is a bit of both. We also know that the organism can survive in the environment itself. It doesn't need a live host to survive. It can survive in slurry for 10 months or more. So this is a very clever and persistent organism which can survive most of what we throw at it. But you have to, in veterinary terms or in
any form of infectious disease terms, you have to reduce the infected load right across the board. So in the wildlife, in the cattle, and in the environment. Now, when you think a badger produces something like 100 grams of feces a day, a cow produces 45 to 50 kilograms of feces a day, you have to get the same environmental benefit, the same benefit to the reservoir, you have to kill about 450 badgers to make up for one retained shedding cow. So, you put in a huge amount of effort to deal with the badgers, but if you retain shedding cows, don't remove them and stop them contaminating the environment and acting as a reservoir, you're really wasting your time and your money.
You mentioned a word here which is a trigger word for farmers, particularly in Northern Ireland, as we have restrictions on it, slurry. You seem to be suggesting that slurry may be a big problem with this as well. Yeah,
well, as I've mentioned, the cows that we found shedding were shedding in their feces. Those feces go into the slurry, and the organism we know can survive slurry. Interestingly, it can't survive composted manure. So if you're keeping your animals on deep litter, when you clean them out, any farmer will know that you clean them out, you put all the manure into a heap, it heats up, and that virtually sterilizes it. So the organism cannot survive that heating. So farmyard manure is relatively safe, whereas slurry is particularly dangerous. And so we're looking to see if it's the slurry that can be one of the transmission or vectors moving it within farms and from farm to farm.
You were over in Northern Ireland last week for a conference. Did you manage to get a word with Minister Putz, or was that not possible?
There was contact made. I understand he is sympathetic to the idea that what we've been doing might be worth a trial in Northern Ireland. I have made some inquiries, and you've certainly got herds there that fall into the description, the category that I'm talking about. The difference between Northern and Southern Ireland is that the Northern Ireland dairy herd is similar to what we have here in Devon. They tend to be larger herds, producing a lot of slurry, kept on concrete and slats, housed through the winter. This is all the risk factors that we have to perpetuate this disease. So I think it will be a great opportunity for us to give it a try if we can find some farmers that are willing to engage. And that final point is probably the most important. There's not so much financial cost in what we have been doing, but it does require some changes in management and some effort from the farmer. And so if you don't get engagement, then don't start. So, it's worth a try for those farmers who want to deal with TB in their herds over and above what they're currently doing. These statutory controls were designed 50 years ago for farms when average herd size was something like 25 cows, when they were kept on straw, when the test was good enough to detect the organism in these small herds. Things have moved on. We have to rethink and review what we're doing and how we're attempting to control this disease.